Hi everyone, and welcome to Printify Tech Talks. I'm super excited about our guest today, as all of you probably use the product that this person built on daily basis. This person was a product director at YouTube, CTO at WeWork, product lead at Apple Apps, VP of product at Spotify, and a senior product manager at Twitter. Let me introduce Shiva Rajaraman. Shiva, thank you very much for joining us today. Your experience is so diverse and so extensive, I was afraid that I have missed something. Did I name all the roles you have contributed to? Have I missed something?
Well, I think I don't know if I told you the latest one. I realized we may have missed that, but I recently joined Facebook to lead their commerce initiative. So shops across Instagram, WhatsApp, etc. So brand new baby now.
Well, congrats on that. So you've been building amazing products that is used by millions of people, and I think everybody in product or engineering would be glad to have at least small fraction of the achievements you have been done. That's why I'm super excited about your today's keynote, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, it's from zero to awesome, finding product market fit and driving growth. Cool. Before I give the virtual floor to you, Shiva, a couple small organizational things for our viewers. So first of all, Shiva will give a 30-minute keynote, and afterwards we'll have a small Q&A session. I encourage everyone to submit their questions via Slido. To do that, please go to slido.com, use hashtag Printify to join, and submit your questions. Also, don't be shy about upvoting them, and we'll try to cover as many as possible, but in a reasonable time frame. Without further ado, Shiva, I'm giving the floor to you, and please continue.
All right, great. I'll start this presentation in a second. I'll just echo what Daniel said, which is to start with, any question goes. I'm sure there's a lot of things top of mind, so happy to jump into that. And often that's the most interesting part of this. So feel free to, don't be shy and share your questions. The second thing is what I'm going to do is go through a series of little stories, little examples or vignettes. And hopefully they'll be entertaining for you, but also spark some questions. So don't hesitate to add more questions as we go through this deck, and I'll try to respond to the ones that are most relevant. So with that, let me get started. Okay, can everyone see that okay? Good? Okay, super. So let me start. So the first thing, I think particularly many of the companies I've worked at, but probably all the companies you're working at now too, is the first piece of making a product is increasingly starting to think about the community aspects around it. If you're starting a product today, it doesn't matter if it's enterprise, it doesn't matter if it's consumer. It's very interesting and I think important to stay close to your customers. And that means from day one, trying to think about who that trusted community of people is and make sure you're talking to them frequently, and sometimes people create groups. Some people just observe behavior on their products or platforms. Sometimes you're doing random calls with someone who's a user of your product and you're just asking them questions every day. And I think that's very, very important now. It used to be that we'd ship something, we'd get it out there for a while, start to get to scale, you start looking at the logs, and then later you might actually start talking to people. And there's usually a gap between those early days of a company and the mature days of a company when you do that. Don't let there be a gap anymore. But with that, let me make a fun little example here. Not sure how widespread this show is, but there's a show called Futurama. Hopefully some of you have heard of it. It's basically a cartoon out there that's obviously got a lot of traction, particularly in the tech community, but beyond. There's this one little video and this one line that became very popular on YouTube when I was working there. And we noticed this a little bit later, but it's basically this neutral response video. It's very simple.
I have no strong feelings one way or the other.
Completely neutral, no big deal. One thing we noticed when we were looking at this video, however, is that the likes and dislikes on this video were exactly the same. And at first I thought it was an engineer came up with some fun April Fool's joke or something like that. But it turns out that if you look at every video on the search for page alongside of this one, always the same, likes, dislikes. This is about 10 years ago. It's still happening today, which is crazy. And what we found was a group of people in the world out there who anytime someone likes one of these videos, they go and dislike it. If someone dislikes it, they go and like it. And they just have this set of videos now over a decade in time that they've kept this balance around neutrality. And it's just a fun side story because I was just, this isn't something we created. It's the openness of the platform. It's the games you can play on YouTube. But it was just so important that some people will care about your platform so much in terms of expression that they will do silly things like this. And it was just a great one that kept us laughing for a long time. And we found many more over time. So the one lesson out of this is it doesn't matter what you're doing. People are probably doing surprising things with your product or service. So keep an eye on that. Learn those stories, share them, because that's a culture around your product that becomes really interesting. And it might be what they're making. It might be, what they're selling through your platform, but it doesn't really matter. Just collect those stories. When you lose sight of those stories, that's usually when you lose a pulse of what your product roadmap should be as well. Okay, next one. So increasingly, we're in a world where it's not just bits, it's bits and physical services and the world, et cetera. And we have a chance in technology not to just be a layer on top of things, but we can change the fundamental service as well. So I'll give you an example from Spotify where we were starting to think a lot about, are we just an aggregator or are we also about content? And we should shape the world of content that flows through Spotify as well in order to meet new use cases. So one framework we use there, a big credit to the CPO who's over there now, Gustav, and a lot of other folks, where we were just trying to figure out how can we take this jobs to be done idea and move it into Spotify. And jobs to be done is nothing new. It's basically saying, let's make sure we're solving on the problem and the impact around the problem. But in this case, we use this framework to challenge a lot of ideas in the company. And this framework also became a way for people, maybe outside of the product development team, to suggest ideas that might be interesting for the company. So in this case, it's really simple. When I am in a given situation, I want to achieve some motivation so that I can achieve an expected outcome. And I'll give you an example of this, which was basically a product that was born out of this, which was codenamed Run to the Beat, and eventually Spotify Running. But the basic idea is very simple. How can music better fit effectively the job of getting in shape, and actually using running to get into shape? How can music help you get into shape, not just be an ambient accompaniment to what you're doing? So in this case, when I'm basically running to great shape and want to get in condition, what do I want to do? I want to stay on pace without having to check the time on my watch the whole time, so that I can stay in my optimal aerobic zone and actually, challenge myself to the 80% level or whatever it might be. And when you think about this problem to be solved, what became interesting was, what's a solution that we could play? And what came out of that was the idea of, well, what if the music stayed at the beat that matched the way you're going to run? I don't have to look at my watch anymore. If I speed up or slow down, maybe it's an uncomfortable pace for me, but the music serves as that metronome keeping me on pace. Now, ultimately, what that meant, however, is that does the world's music match your ability to have effectively a certain beat? And the short answer was that you could probably find a song or many songs for many different beats and personalize that to you. But here's a chance to go back and say, what if we could invent a new track that could actually have that modality? In other words, a track itself, if I move faster or slower, could still also speed up to the beat or slow down to the beat that match the pace I want to run. And I'll give you an example of that. We basically brought in a bunch of artists into the company. It was pretty funny to see artists on treadmills and testing stuff and working directly with engineers to hack a new kind of concept. But what came out of it were things like this. Ellie Goulding is a really hardcore runner, but also a musician, of course. And so here's an example of a track that she created that could basically change to the form or the beat that was necessary to keep you on pace. So this is slow. This is basically how I run, not too fast. Now if I turn it up a little bit, typical jog right here. And I share that as an example primarily for this. Running itself was not necessarily the most sticky feature, but it became a great marketing feature for a group of people who were trying to compare Spotify with other types of music. And here you had with Spotify a differentiated way for exercise. And that became very appealing. And obviously Spotify's subscription numbers show that as you look at the overall bets that Spotify made. But what was interesting here is like stepping back and not taking anything for granted. One of the best things you can do is find areas that are underserved and where people don't have good fit. And what you do is you vertically integrate to create a better solution. Most great startups in the world are based on vertically integrating to create a better solution, which includes disrupting business models or creating, not just being an aggregator for the same content or service, but being an aggregator for new versions of that content or service is really what delights people. So when you think about what you do in a startup particularly, start thinking about what you're disrupting, because when you're small and new, you can disrupt business models or use cases. When you're older and established, it's really hard to disrupt the business model or the ecosystem you're in. So now's the time to think about it. Okay, next one. New technology, but old tropes. At the end of the day, we are humans and we respond to psychology. And there's a lot of that that's basically baked into us over time. And one of the things that's interesting in marketing technology is how do you take something brand new and marry that effectively to what people are used to? And what are the forms of delight? And I'll give you an example of that, which is Discover Weekly was effectively one of the first successful personalized recommendations on Spotify. In the era before I joined, Spotify actually didn't do many recommendations. This isn't me per se. They'd made acquisitions for it, et cetera, all this good stuff. But what was clear was that it wasn't clear how to do those recommendations. And there was a lot of debate around that. One set of debates was, should they just be everywhere? You know, if you looked at YouTube, for example, you play a video, it just auto plays the next one and the next one. And if you see any video, you see a bunch of results next to it that are all recommendations. And you'll see them all over the product. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it just means that you're not necessarily creating anticipation towards an event. You know, you just come to YouTube, you see the next video, it'll keep you playing, and it's very successful. There's another idea which said that why don't we take some of these recommendations and package them together so people can actually look forward to them, and we can provide a different set of context around that recommendation. So if you have recommendations everywhere, for example, your bar for recs is higher because what you're doing is saying, here's the next thing you should watch, or here's a list that's really, really good to basically come into. But let's say you have a bunch of brand new music for you. You don't know if it's going to be relevant for someone. It's a guess. So your hit rate might be 2 out of 5 instead of 2 out of 3. And so you want to get people in the right context of saying, I'm in something new, but not all of this is going to be right for me. But maybe I'll find 2 things that I love, which is also delightful. So the idea was to package up a lot of new music recommendations for you. Well, new for you, not necessarily new to the world, in a set called Discover Weekly. And then the question was, do you drop it on Friday? Like historically, that's where new music is basically launched. Or do you start on a different day? And one of the ideas here was to start on Monday, because we wanted to shift people who are weekend users to using it during the work week for their commute or, you know, while they're at school, whatever it might be at that time. Obviously, we're all at home now, you know, it's a different world. But at the time, it was very important to try to get people to use Spotify as a habit 7 days a week versus just 2 in some cases. Or if they were just using it at work, make sure that it was a good service that could be used on the weekend for lean back. So Discover Weekly dropped. And a lot of battles on whether that should go out Monday, Friday, etc. But what ended up happening was this, which was that we dropped it on Monday. It was packaged together. It was not just sprinkled everywhere. And the result of that was that we got tweets like this when it launched. And it's one of the best ones. That's the headline of the slide. But Spotify's Discover Weekly is truly a godsend. It's like a personalized Christmas every Monday. It's probably the best product feedback you can get. Can't wait for my Discover Weekly tomorrow. This idea of anticipation. This playlist is something I look forward to everyone. They know me so well. This was like that personalization, even though it was kind of like a show. And then the sadder tweet, which is the only good thing about Monday, is new Spotify Discover Weekly playlist. But the point here, I think was very important, is that you package this together, it developed a brand, and it dropped on a certain day that you looked forward to. And that's really just an old marketing, kind of lesson or trope, which is basically people love anticipation, they love surprises, and they love repeatability. That's driven the world of TV shows for a long time. So trying this out became really exciting and ended up leading to a lot of ritualistic sets at the company. And one last one. Biggest accomplishment we had, making Monday the best day of the week. Very hard. If you can do that, do it. Okay. Next thing, we're going to get to a little bit of the harder side of it, which is like, what are these metrics that you look at around retention? And you might come up with new ideas. You come up with a great proposition. You want to get it out there. You want to test it. You want to see what's happening. But let me get into some of the metrics. I think these are probably familiar to many of you, but I'll just recap it quickly. First thing is just effectively cohort-based retention. No surprises here. On the left, you've got what month effectively did a new user of the service come into play. And then you go to the right, which is effectively the percentage you retain month over month. So if you take a look at January 20th and you look over who's around 6 months from them, 84%. This is obviously a very beautiful service. It is rare to see anything so green in your life, but let's assume that this is perfection. Now, there's 2 ways of looking at this. One is consumer free, the other one is consumer paid, and I'll get into enterprise in a second. When you look at consumer free, there's just some basic rules here, which is that, if it's less than 20%, whatever you're doing is just not working. You're not retaining people. Most people are leaving. This won't be a good business at that rate. 20 to 30% really need drastic changes. Like if you're trying something out, you've been working on it for a while, still at 20 to 30%, you probably just don't have a proposition that's meaningful enough, or you're not able to connect with users where that proposition is valuable. So you need to try something drastic. 30 to 40%, not bad, right? You want to start to iterate. You probably have something that's working here, but you maybe just aren't driving your growth levers enough. Maybe you're not, your use case is still a little too sloppy and you're losing people. But above 40%, have a party. It's an amazing goal. And particularly in consumer-free products, it's just very difficult to get there. But if you do, this is something you want to start to pour, more acquisition into, because you've got a product that's working. On subs, one important part is that a lot more people are paying for subs now, so these numbers move quickly right now in our time. But cost of acquisition is higher, and therefore LTV matters. And what it usually means is that you have a higher bar for the consumer subscription. In other words, people are paying for this. So you really need to be in that 40 to 50% retention range, and above 50% is your true target here. Costs more to get people in, costs more to get them to give you your wallet. Once they give you your wallet, you want them to really stick around. And so that bar is just much higher in this case, not surprisingly. Okay, now let's look at enterprise. And enterprise, we look at 2 different types of retention metrics. One is logos, which is basically number of customers you have. So depending on what segment you're going in, there's different types of retention. So if you look at small businesses, really small and mediums, you look at 60% plus is good. That's the number of customers you want to retain over time. The reason why it's not super high is because just a lot of businesses go out of business. A lot of businesses don't need the service, or they're prioritizing them, or a few services that they need. So generally it's lower. But when you get up to enterprise, like really large enterprises, it better be, very high, because one, it usually involves a lot of integration. They have custom requirements at times. Even if you don't permit them, usually they're doing things custom around your product. So what ends up happening is that you want to see an 80% logo retention rate, because if you don't have that, you're probably wasting your time with that segment. And there's not as many large enterprises out there. So if you're churning through a bunch of them, probably not the right fit. The dollar side is important too. This is monthly recurring revenue. And obviously, if you're keeping a certain set of customers, every month you're getting more recurring revenue, and that should be above 100%, right? When you're kind of in this long-term steady state. And you can see that here. I'll jump back to this for a second, but just to show you a chart, probably even this one is a generous chart, but generally what you start to see is in July, okay, we're starting to see some green here at an earlier stage. More people are coming in, they're retaining longer. So our net monthly recurring revenue is higher, right? Is greater than 100%. We'd like to still see it growing from there, but this is at least a good sign we're on the right track. Now, going back to the most important part, however, is that when you really, each product's different, and these are just rules of the road. So what you really want to do is, once you have your data, which is easy to instrument with so many tools out there now, you really want to look for anomalies or opportunities, because when you see your broad customer set and they're laid out over one graph, you might be doing well with someone and you might be doing poorly with someone else. So find out where those people are. For example, there's a famous proxy, the folks who, basically created the email service Superhuman came up with this, and it's been out there for a long time, but they've popularized it. But the basic idea is like to survey all your customers and say, if my service went away, you can no longer use it, would you be disappointed, or would you not care? And what you're looking for is a rate of people greater than 40% who say, I would be disappointed or very disappointed if your service disappeared. If you start to see that kind of signal, putting aside your graphs, you want to understand that population, because that population is the ones that really care about your product, and you have good fit with that population. You don't want to care so much in the early stages, particularly about people who are like, I don't care. You just don't worry about, serving everyone today. Find out the ones you serve really well, and figure out what is it that they're doing. What are they doing before, after? What problems are you solving? What unexpected things are they doing with your product? Figure that out, because you want to grow that bubble. And if that is a larger one, and if that's a large TAM, to our target addressable market, then you have a huge, exciting opportunity here. Now, if it ends up being that the people who love your product and can't live without it are tiny and niche, you might have a different problem. But that's what you want to find out really quickly. And it's one of the more important things that you can learn in this early stage. Okay, next thing is just what is, you launch a product, a new user comes on board. And I don't care if it's enterprise, a service, etc. Usually what you're trying to do is you have a clock that starts ticking the second someone signs up for your service. And that clock is basically, what is their patience to get value out of this? And in order for them to see the value, what do you need them to do? So I'll give another example that we can all relate to with Spotify. But one of the key things that Spotify does and still tests in different markets and different places is how many reminders can they give you in that first week to try different things about your service. Okay. Now let's imagine all of these things are coming into my Gmail inbox. Okay. A lot of them are filtered out as promotions. I probably don't see them all. If I do see some of them, I'm not in the mood, or I don't have the time to do it right now. So that first week is all about saying, hey, just try to get them to look at one thing that might be valuable. Try to have them take one action that will translate to good value for them. So for example, a lot of people on Spotify don't know that there's a radio feature. A lot of people on Spotify use curated playlists, which is awesome, but don't ever create their own playlist. Or what is normally the case is most people go and try to create their playlist, because a lot of them are still in the mental model of what iTunes was like. So, but they don't take advantage of any of Spotify's program playlists or other types of features where you don't have to do any work. What ends up being important at Spotify is that you have a mix of using these things for different use cases. So a lot of what you'll see Spotify do in week one is try to get you to try different things. Obviously, right now, podcast is a big push for the company. So they're actively trying to get people to listen to podcasts on Spotify because they know that's super important listening for different types of use cases in a person's day. One of those use cases might be the morning commute when we get back to going back to work, is that spoken word is very popular there. Did you know that exists on Spotify and you can use it that way? Still, most people don't realize that. So I think these are very important for you. So step back and ask yourself, when I launch a new product or service, what are 2 or 3 of the things, or maybe just one thing, that I know if someone habitually uses, they will be in love and you get the most value out of my product. And don't be shy about trying to get them to do that in many different ways. If a whole month goes by and they still don't use it or try something, they're going to churn. There's no doubt about it. So you have a limited clock on which you can do this. So try different things and get creative. We tried a lot of different things out there. There's a lot of tools out there. Like as an example, at the time, Intercom was fairly new when I was there. But this was the idea that I could pop up anything in the app and ask a question or get feedback. And what I loved about this is that now this is like almost taken for granted in new services, which is like that engagement. But going back and talking about how you can talk to your customers all the time, make sure you have tools inside your product that you can spin up random questions. Don't think about complicated, heavy surveys. Just get this anecdotal feedback. It will couple what you're seeing in the logs and let you optimize. Now, this is super important because if you don't, then you just might miss things that become opportunities to iterate, particularly as you're scaling. And in many cases, you might be far away from your customers. So setting up a call is not easy, but in product can be a great solution. Okay, how are we doing? How are we doing on time, folks?
Can you?
Yeah, we have a couple minutes.
Okay, cool. I'll go through 2 more sections and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. Okay.
Cool.
Okay. Here's the next thing. This has to do more with like managing teams and setting things up. But I think a very important thing when you're in a new startup is making that shift, which doesn't have to happen early, but has to happen later as you start to grow. Early on, it's not really about the metrics and the frameworks. Just design a great product that's easy to use, that solves a problem. And there's nothing in the data that teaches you much about that. You've got to bring your instinct to it. You've got to decide what's your design bar. Am I really solving this problem? Is it easy to use? Is it easy to talk about? Is it easy to refer? And that's very much qualitative aspects of the product. And does it do what it's set to do? And if you can do that, amazing. But as you start to scale, you start to realize, well, there's other things we can do. And that's where you shift over to this language of goals. So one thing I like to do is that when you get to slightly more mature state, you get on the whiteboard or you get on a piece of paper and you say, what's my goal here? And start to work with your teams to bucket what are the different ways that I can achieve that goal. So let's take a look at retention. And I'll use, again, Spotify as an example. There's many ways you can improve retention. One is more personalization and recommendations. That makes sense. Second area you can improve retention is to start to think about what's called win back. If people are about to churn, what are the offers I can give that person? So pricing, offers, etc., is another way to improve retention because they may just be leaving you because of economic value. Third way to improve retention is more content, right? Like eat more use cases, more time in the day. So obviously with Spotify, that could be podcasts, for example, right? Or it could be video, or it could be different types of experiences that are there. But these are buckets of ideas. And what's really interesting is that if you have a goal like improve retention, which almost everyone will have, right? You might have a series of bets you want to make. And then you get down to tactics. So when you're working with your teams, ideally is you create these branches that they can start to navigate and traverse. But you're not prescriptive on the tactics per se, but you do want people to fall in love with that goal. And what happens in a lot of companies is you think about a tactic and you fall in love with the tactic and it doesn't work. And you feel disappointed as a result. think it's really important for teams to not fall in love with the tactic, but fall in love with the goal. Okay, I tried this tactic, it didn't work, I'm ready to move on, is a very important thing in every company. So what you can do is by writing these things out and starting to hypothesize a series of tactics, and just by putting them on paper, people tend to like fall, they see like the opportunity cost of just focusing on one thing and realize they can go to the next thing because they know they've written it down, they've thought about it, they've fallen in love with it, maybe less so than what they were doing before, but it's there as an option. So this is a framework I think is really important for a company, particularly when you get to that growth stage. Everything becomes something you can do, and teams will fall in love with one thing. And that's normal, that's human nature. But try to create a framework by which people are falling in love with the metric. That way they remember that this is the goal. If I hit the goal, I should try many things to get there. And if one doesn't work, move on. And psychologically, that's super important. But if you don't write it down, moving on can feel like a failure. And failures are good, but failures feel bad if there's nothing next. So always keep an eye on what's next. So related to that, I think one of the key things is trying to figure out, like, what are those set of things that we should be looking at before, after, etc. And so in this case, I think what's important is that you can do a lot of things to test propositions before you build things. You can survey your people, right? Like, particularly what I'm interested in is they're using my product for this. What do they do before? What do they do after? What's the surrounding space of jobs that I might be able to make easier for them, or that just might be friction relative to using my product or service? Okay. And then of course, it's just like part of this is getting into this muscle of saying, hey, I've solved a problem. What's the next problem I should solve? And if you can get that lens, that's not easy to observe in your logs again. You actually have to go talk to people and find out before or after. So first, to start off with, no more fake news. We're pretty much sick of that, but fake ads are okay. And what I mean by that is that often you don't have time to build every prototype or proposition, but you can go out there and ask people and say, hey, here's an ad for something I might build. And I can test that out with some targeting and all that good stuff and see if people respond. So for example, it'd be the equivalent of saying, hey, how many of you effectively, if YouTube created a music app, would you download it, right? Or you can just say it differently, which is like YouTube Music, dedicated playlists X, Y, and Z. And there's another ad that's running, which is radio oriented. And there's another ad that's stressing music video. See which one drives the most traffic. And your conversion, because you don't have an app yet, is not to download the app, but is to sign up for when it's ready. Tell me more about when it's ready. And you can use these as proxies to learn a little bit about how does the real world understand what you're trying to do, and how does the real world express interest in what you're trying to do. So it's pretty basic, but basically what you're saying is like, market your idea, right, before you've built it and see what traction it has. It's not going to be definitive, but it's a good exercise in like telling the headline story of what you're trying to do and seeing if it resonates with people. I don't believe this should be driving all product development, but I think it's an interesting tool when you have many different things that you're competing with. A lot of people do this with pricing tests for new services, of course. A lot of people do this with teasing out new product ideas ahead of building it. But it's an interesting lever, and with the world of like targeted advertising we have, it becomes very effective to reach populations that might not be scalably addressable, historically. This is a fun one. Amazon has recently retired these buttons, but I always made fun of them a little bit until I heard the story. So the Amazon button basically came about by understanding the before and after cases of using Amazon for many people. And they found two populations. And one population was that you basically had students whose parents didn't trust them with money, okay? And so basically what they're saying is like, look, the kids need household goods, they need stuff for their dorm room, all that normal stuff. So, but I don't want to give them the $100 every month to pay for that stuff because they'll probably just go drink it, okay? So instead, I was like, hey, for these commodities, you can order whenever you want and you've got that flexibility. but it's going to be the button that I'm going to give you instead of the app, right? And so I thought that was pretty interesting. On less light note, there's also elderly. And at the time when Amazon was starting out and got to scale, a lot of elderly folks would rely on their families to buy them these goods. And they weren't yet digitally savvy enough to use the apps. That's changed a lot, particularly over the last year. But at the time, this is a convenient way to care for someone else, which is take the staple goods they want, put those buttons around the house. And if you need more and you're running out, just click the button. So something that felt very silly to me made a lot more sense when you understood the before and after, which was there was friction in using the app, or there was a lack of trust in using the app, but you could solve that through other means. And I think Amazon generally is a good company about looking at things like this, which is if there's a customer pain point, solve it however you can. And I think a lot of startups start to lose sight of that, which is that ecosystem around them. Maybe they can reach this population if only they did this. And that's a really important lens to look at when you think about higher growth down the line. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop and open it up for questions so we can get into that.
Thank you, Shiva. A lot of insightful stuff. So yeah, we have a lot of questions coming in.
Cool.
I will still encourage people to submit more and upvote. The first one we have here is, what advice would you give someone wanting to pursue a career similar to yours?
Few things. One is, okay, in this world, I think what is really important for a product is to have start getting like muscle in design, okay? And I think I did this a little bit later in my life. And what I mean by product design is not being the expert and doing a designer's job, but starting to appreciate when I look at any single app, why did they design it this way? What do you think they're trying to do differently? You know, what are the dominant ways you might do something? So for example, in the last 5 years, I've really been obsessed about like how people checkout flows are evolving on the internet, right? One click, well, what do they collect? Where do they put the buttons? Where do they put the payment method choices? Like I obsess about those small things, but I'm trying to get a picture in my head about, where is it going to go? And so this kind of rooting in design and obsessing about this is something I think every product manager should start to have as you look to the future. That's one. Second piece is, one of the key things in most companies that can be very differentiating and to get these jobs is to be very good with your analytics. So I shared some frameworks, but there's plenty of frameworks out there. I think it's really just being adept in how can I confidently answer a question through data, or when can data support what I'm doing if I manipulate it, right? But I really want the honest picture of what's happening. So it's not that you, again, I'm not suggesting everyone become a data scientist, but you need to like be honest with data and be very truthful with it, and also learn how to visualize and present it in the right way to make a point clear. And so I often talk about this, if I could do the query and I could write, put the graph on a slide, I want to be very good at those, because that's our language about communicating for many things. There's an inspiring side of it, but there's also the, like, am I telling the story correctly and honestly and challenging, what can often be glib assumptions. And so what you see, I think, in orgs today that are very data driven is truth really wins. And the people who are best at articulating that truth and showing what the options are get very good. So I would make sure you feel very good with data and really visualizing and presenting it, which is another aspect of it. And so there's some cool courses popping up and people are doing this type of stuff. The frameworks aren't difficult. It's more that most people don't have a lot of practice using them. So I would start to lean into that dimension as well. And then finally, the third thing, which is at the end of the day, when you look at folks like myself, I think one of the key things is we have to be crisp, and we're always working on this, but part of our role is to inspire and communicate through presentations like this, or in a company, or in a small group. And being able to be very clear and confident on that is important. Like, I'm always working on becoming more concise and speaking more plainly. I can often be too verbal and too confusing, So that's my area to improve still. But what I would say is that don't give up on public speaking. You might find that to be difficult. It might be hard for you, but if you practice it, you'll get better at it. And it's important to practice it, because if I could put those three things together, I have a good eye of design and where the world's going, and a good idea of bad design. If I can understand data and visualize it to help make decisions, and then I can confidently inspire and speak about a topic. You put those three things together, you can basically do any job, okay? But you certainly will be ready for a product job or a product leadership job. And you got to do all those three things, however, to get, more and more up in your career on this front. But you start with any one of those things, I think it's a good way to spend your time.
Thank you. Talking about professional growth and personal development, there are a couple of questions related to that. So, for instance, what are the best resources that help you along the way? Maybe you can name some examples.
Yeah, so there's a few. Okay, let me talk at the strategy side. I read Ben Thompson's Stratechery blog. It's a famous one. Probably every CEO in the Valley reads it too, and increasingly everywhere. But the reason why I like it is that there's usually something going on in the world today. And companies making a decision, company just did earnings, company did a merger, or maybe they had a failure. Ben breaks that down, and it becomes like really valuable to see how a board or leadership should be thinking about these decisions. So having that top-down view is really excellent. So that's one example. There's another one. I got to remember the name of it, but it used to be called like Cool UI or something like that, but they just changed their name. I think to Screen Rants or something like that. But what they do, this is on the design side, they pick examples from designers who have rebuilt a product, like reimagined Spotify or YouTube, or have look at new things that have launched and talk about the design elements, or maybe look at just one component. Here's someone who's trying to try a new modal screen that does something. So I love looking at that, because this is like candy in our profession. These are like the things that really challenge. Wow, that's pretty cool. But it keeps my design instincts really fresh. And I think it's Screen Rants is the name of it. And I just subscribe to it. It's like a word of the day kind of, newsletter. But I love looking at the mocks, and a lot of times it helps put you to sleep too. It's the last thing you do in the day. The third tool I would say is I am increasingly a fan of people who are doing the career shift, taking courses like product school and things like that. They're all online now. Why I like those types of things is because some of these basics like retention, etc., you don't learn it in any school. You learn it on the job. What if you don't have the job yet? So the product school and a few things like that are filling that gap. And I think it's pretty exciting. So you don't have to learn it from people like me. You don't have to learn it by getting the job first, but you can start to develop a perspective on that through these new courses that, aren't in college and, otherwise could be barriers to getting a great gig.
Talking about, you mentioned that you look at other products and you look how they solve certain problems in unique and efficient ways. Can you name a product that you recently discovered that you were amazed by?
Oh, yeah. Well, there's a weird, I recently discovered it and I was amazed by it. And it's a very small utility. Okay, it's called Miranda. Okay, and Miranda is effectively, so I have teams in 3 different time zones. Okay, so, and even for this call, I was using Miranda because I'd always get confused about what time it is for anyone. And what it lets you do is effectively just show a particular time, and it'll show you the time zones, comparable times. Okay, but what's excellent about it is that it's just one scrolling wheel, and if you expand out, it goes slower, and if you expand in, it goes faster. Okay, just a basic motion like that, and it's so simple and elegant. I'm like, why? It's like obvious that everyone should be doing it this way, but because they just nailed it, I'm like, this is beautiful on the eyes. It's easy. I can get to the right time at the right point, and I'm often in just like one hand and able to do it. Right. So it's one of these things where you could reinvent a simple utility for this one, I definitely fell in love with that. The things I'm most frustrated by is that I watch a lot of content on iPads, and there's a bunch of streaming services out there. Okay. So you've got Netflix, you've got Amazon, Disney Plus, HBO Max, whatever, name it, it's out there now. And you look at how Netflix works on the iPad, it's beautiful. Okay. It's just small little things. If I tap twice on the right, it automatically skips ahead, right? You always have the skip intro, etc. buttons, but particularly when you're on an iPad, it's important that they're not tiny and they're not in a little bar, right? So they get everything right, the weight, the spacing, the location. Then you use HBO Max and it was garbage. Like you have to pull this thing up. There's a tiny little audio scrubber, like all these things that should be like dominant design right now, but they don't do. So I'm also obsessive about, like when I'm seeing these experiences on the exact same content experience on multiple screens, and they've picked different choices, it's infuriating. It's the same way that there's still no TV remote control that works well, right? Like they're confusing, it's etc. Or the microwave for that matter. Like I think that's a UI that needs some work. But I think it's also really interesting as a product head to step back every once in a while and say, which experiences am I most frustrated with on a daily basis? And could I make them better? And how would I make them better? That's a good like habit to get into. So I obsess right now a lot about microwave controls, and I'm still not sure why they even exist. So, like I should just be able to say, heat it up for 30 seconds and it should work, but that doesn't exist in the world. So that might be the next thing. So we'll see.
True. So another question is related to your experience, and it goes as follows. You have contributed to many great companies and products. Which company and or product you enjoyed the most and why? Well, I understand for product person, it's like picking your favorite child, but...
No. I think it's different things. Like I've also had, I like to be transparent. A few times I've jumped into something where it just wasn't the right fit for me. And so I've learned as much out of that. Like I wasn't long at Apple, for example. I'm actually really excited about Apple. I enjoyed that job quite a bit. It was pretty wide responsibility. It's just the cadence by which that company works and how they solve problems is different than what I'm used to, right? Which is much more of like release all the time. But for many people, Apple, and for me too, like why I joined was like, this is like a dream, right? Like never thought that opportunity would even be on my plate, even a few years beforehand. So from that perspective, I feel like everyone's got its touch. But if I could break it down, for me, YouTube was the school. I really learned a lot of my skills there. I had the best managers and varied set of experiences, monetization, discovery, creators, right? And, eventually mobile and consumer. You put all those things together, I'm like, wow, I learned, I had a different job every year, and often a different manager, but they were all good and they all invested in me before I was even ready. So that was like my school, and I'll always be grateful for that. Then I look at Spotify, that was a chance to play more of a leadership role and set a strategy around recommendations and new content. And that was super exciting for me too. I actually moved to Sweden for that. So it's also a big life change. And so it'll always be precious for me. Spotify, I have some regrets because it could have been for 4 years, but we had to, at least 4 years. I could probably still be there now, but we had to move back to the US for family reasons. And so for me, it's a little bit of like, just got started 2.5 years. It could have been longer, but at that point in my life, I had to put family first. And so, but I really enjoyed that. And I think what was most exciting about that was there's a company, Spotify, which is largely, iTunes in the cloud at that time. And you're shifting it to be a recommendations service for you, where creators and listeners can get together. And you're trying new content and new forms. It's lovely to be at that stage, right? Because you've got capacity. You're not a single thing company, but now you've got 5 things. You need to figure out which of those 5 can work. So that's a super fun time if you ever get that chance. Then I go to WeWork, and WeWork was like, generally also, I would say, very exciting. I was really excited about it because now I would be the tech person in a non-tech business, and it was crazy, as you've probably read about. And so that part was not so exciting, but I would put it all together and I would just say that Well, it was really interesting to see how technology can disrupt something so old school, and this at Printify too, right? Like you're disrupting old school mechanics. And if you can make technology work for that, it's a huge business and it's very exciting. You just have to make small strides, but they're very painful to get there. So that's also a good moat potentially. So I put all those things together, and so I'm glad I went through that experience. I think what WeWork taught me was what's that board lens on a business, and governance and good habits on that front are very important. And I think I learned a lot through that, even though it ended up being quite, a devastating end. At the end of the day, I was like, it's still worth learning, right? And so everything should not be about economics or the products you ship. Did you grow as a person? And I certainly did. So no is real favorite, but if you have to talk it all, a lot of times you have a lot of loyalty to what gave you your right to be here. And so I'm always indebted to Google and YouTube because took a bet on me before I was ready.
One follow-up on this. So YouTube is obviously a Silicon Valley darling, and Spotify is European unicorn. In terms of culture, are they similar, either different? What's your take on this?
Yeah, it was really interesting. I think it's counterintuitive in some ways, which is like what I think it all comes down to is that like Daniel, the CEO of Spotify, is an incredibly strategic long-term thinker. Okay. And so he's got qualities, I think, of some of the Silicon Valley leaders as well. We're looking way out here, not just looking day to day. And I think that was super important. So, but then the other side of it was, what is it about the culture of working together? Spotify did a lot of stuff together because you had two things that were just like cultural patterns. Everyone disappears in the summer, like you shut down. So there's no launches in the middle of, the summer. Everyone goes dark. I think everyone comes back refreshed. There's a lot of that. Whereas when I look at a lot of US companies, it's been just run. And, I could even go further and talk about some Chinese companies I've had exposure to where it's 996. And it's just like, you're always on the risk of burnout. You didn't have that at Spotify as much, but as a result, it really focused people on getting as much work done in the time they had. Like inefficiency was not something people liked. So, and I think a lot of US companies can learn from that, frankly, right? Because a lot of times you'll have meetings for the sake of meetings for the sake of meetings. And what are we solving in this? Is it a decision-making meeting? Is it about sharing information? I don't know. We just got to show up. And I was like, no, kill it, right? And so I think this kind of structure is important, and Spotify was much better at that. If I step back, I'm still always interested in the idea of like, why can Sweden, a small nation, right? And you all are facing this right now too, right? These great, like small European countries have a disproportionate amount of entrepreneurism than others. Why? Like what's creating that? And I think in the case of, the Nordics, there was this element of people can take a little bit more risk because of the safety nets they have. And that's important, and good education systems and stuff. And so, Americans fear that socialism kills entrepreneurialism, right? But these are counterexamples to that. So I'm curious about that. Now, we have a great political divide. It's a whole nother talk I can do for you. I worked on some elections, but I would say that I'm a little worried that people feel like these things are in opposition, and they're not. And when you work in these companies and you live in those places, there's as much, everything on the spectrum of entrepreneurs. There's enough greed, right? There is, hunger. There is, I got to solve the world's biggest problems. That exists everywhere in the world. The question is, do we have the fabric to support it? And what was interesting, I think, in Sweden was being exposed to as many entrepreneurs as I saw in the US. There was no difference. They all had the same dreams, ambitions, etc. And then you ask yourself, okay, if that's not the difference, then there must be other things that create this in such a small population. So I think that's an unanswered question that I'm interested in.
Following up on this, do you believe that location of HQ still matters in post-COVID world?
I personally believe that we have realized that you can be as productive outside of the office, okay? And I have a feeling, though, which I think we can all relate to, which is like being on video conference all the time is also a pain. It's not great. So there's got to be a hybrid, which is, I think, like, I love the idea of maybe like 3 days. Most people work predominantly independently in a lot of these companies, and they get together every once in a while for a group huddle. So I like the idea of a hybrid, which is that, hey, you can work from home, you can work from wherever you want, in fact, anywhere in the world, right? But you might have to check in on a cadence. So make sure you can check in on that cadence. Make sure that once every 3 months, you can come back to wherever headquarters is, or your local version of headquarters, and come together, because we're still social people. And I think that interaction is important at times. But I think if you're a company today and you're just trying to hire in one geography, you better have, home country advantage to do that, right? Some kind of advantage that lets you do that. Otherwise, you're just missing out on talent in many different places. And so I think right now, I hope what we catalyze is a lot more, remote opportunities for people, but we need to figure out how to cluster them together when they need to be together. And so, it's like, everyone says this, but, used to be we'd go on an offsite in order to connect, right? Like it might be you bring people to campus to connect. And so that could be one way to do it. And you might have 6 campuses, who cares, right? But the idea of having a gathering space, I think, is interesting for when you need it. And let's be honest, when you have families, et cetera, working at home is not a great experience for a lot of people. And so they need just like the kids go to school, you need a little bit of your chance to go to work. And so it might be local little offices that you can go check into for, a couple of days a week, but the rest of your time's at home. So we'll see. I think it's fun though to observe. And obviously for, when you look in Europe, right, and this has been happening for a while, right, where you tend to spread out of a country and have offices in different places, all in a similar time zone. That works really well, right? Lets you get talent, lets you create missions in different spaces. So that's been relatively new for the US. Of course, there are satellite offices here, but they're often seen as remote secondary offices. And I think we're going to change that over the next 5 years.
Thank you. So there are a lot of questions regarding the materials. We will provide them in stream comments afterwards. We will reach out to Shiva to provide us some materials afterwards. So one last question. What is one myth about your profession, I guess, in that product leadership or field that you want to debunk? So one myth about the product profession that you want to debunk.
I think there's this concept often that the product manager is like the pure CEO of the business, okay? And we say that a lot, and I think we just be careful with what it means. I think generally a good product person is usually not that liked, okay? Because they're saying no to a lot of things and they're saying yes to what's important. But in a positive way, I think the way to think about the product role is this is the person who sets a quality bar, right? And stays true to the goals you're trying to achieve. So they become a good sieve by which ideas come in. If the product feels wonky or starts getting too confusing, they defend it. If the product is not meeting those goals, they push to move to new bets to try to hit those goals. So they end up being I think of the product person as the single source of truth, right? Like that's their role in some ways. And if they're great and they get better, they're also an incredible source of inspiration in aligning people around those goals. But ideally, a bunch of people want to work with them because by working with the product person, your best ideas that come from many places get into the product. But don't be surprised when that product person says, well, what do you think you're trying to achieve? Why does that matter? Why should we do this versus that? And if you don't have good answers for that, don't get mad at them. They're guarding the goal, right? That's how you should view them. So rather than CEO, I think they're the great custodian of the product and ideally the visionary of where the product should go. But a good visionary is finding ideas from different places and trying to put them together.
Thank you very much. Shiva, it was a very insightful conversation and thank you for the slide. Kent, thank you very much, and I thank everybody on the stream as well. And I wish you a pleasant rest of the day. Thank you for joining.
And good evening to everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye.